Hi, and welcome to Responsa Radio, where you ask and we answer questions of Jewish law in modern times. I'm Rabbi Avi Killip, Executive Vice President at Hadar, here with Rabbi Ethan Tucker, Rosh Yeshiva at Hadar, a center for Jewish learning and community building based in New York City. You can check us out and learn more at hadar.org. On this show, we get to talk about questions in halakha. And oftentimes the questions in halakha are edge cases, right? Extremes that then help us learn not just how to behave in those extreme instances, but usually and hopefully also offer us something to extract from there towards the rest of our lives. So we're going to have a question today that I think hits on one of these extremes. This is actually the second time we've done a question related to the scope of pikuach nefesh. This idea that we have to save a life.
Yeah.
And extraordinary measures are permitted in order to save a life. They write, I have a question about the scope of pikuach nefesh. I am an attorney currently working on a death penalty appeal on behalf of a convicted client. We have a brief in the case that is due on a Friday, and, as is my usual practice, I lined up assistance from non-Jewish colleagues in case the brief isn't ready when Shabbat starts. But was that necessary here, given that I am trying to prevent an execution and save a life? Are there any circumstances in which it would be permissible to work on a death penalty case on Shabbat? So there's a lot here.
Yeah.
We know in advance that the case is going to be on a Friday, and also this is a convicted person. I don't know whether those will play in, but would love to hear, like, where do we even start?
I think this is a question that requires a number of steps to get there. Two preliminary things before we really get into the meat of it. So you talked about how we did another episode on Pikuach Nefesh, and actually one of the things we took up there was the question of, do you violate Shabbat for someone who doesn't observe Shabbat? Do you violate Shabbat? Is there a difference between Jewish and non-Jewish victims or people in danger, et cetera? And we went through that. We looked at the whole history of that. We're not going to address that here. I'm just going to assume for these purposes that, yes, you would in principle violate Shabbat for this client vis-a-vis who they are, their status, your relationship with them. And you can see the earlier episode for how you would get to that.
So this is a podcast footnote homework. Go check that out there.
Exactly. So just assuming that, taking that angle off the table, the other preliminary thing that is important to say is that we also have a strong principle laid out in the Mishnah that not only does the saving of a life supersede Shabbat, but safek pikuach nefesh, the possible saving of a life, the possibility that this intervention might save someone's life, or the possibility that someone's life is in danger, right, is nonetheless able to override Shabbat.
Yeah, actually, it makes me realize that we did another episode that related to this, which was about the suicide hotline.
That's right.
On manning the suicide hotline on Shabbat, which also had this concept of the possibility of saving a life.
That's right. So let's build up our case a little bit. And again, let's sort of bear with a number of details here. Number one, the temple service supersedes Shabbat. Okay, premise number one. When you look at how the Torah talks about the sacrificial regime.
This is very old news, and it surprises me all the time.
Right? Like, Uveyom HaShabbat, Shnei Chvasim. There are two lambs offered on the altar on Shabbat.
Explain that to us. What is going on there?
Yeah, I mean, there's something deep and profound there about saying the restrictions of Shabbat are meant to create a certain kind of society, but then there's like relationship with God that sort of must continue uninterrupted in terms of the Olat HaTamid, the daily offering, and the observance and celebration of Shabbat itself requires something extra to be brought. Lots of ways to think about that. But right, piece one is just recognizing Shabbat is super important. The temple service, even though it does not directly involve saving anyone's life, right, is one of the other things that supersedes Shabbat. I think it's a little bit beyond this discussion of how we think about that. You could think about that as there's sort of a national institution that's not a personal institution, and those things trump Shabbat.
I'm sitting here thinking I would love to do a whole episode on this, but how would I make it into a modern question? It's not a particularly modern question.
Well, the modern way it comes up actually is thinkers trying to think about, like, in the modern state of Israel, do certain national functions actually supersede Shabbat, even if you can't peg them to saving a life?
Or maybe we'll just do a special season on Jewish law in ancient times.
Yeah, that'd be awesome. In any event, okay, so premise number one, temple service supersedes Shabbat. Premise number two, we don't execute people on Shabbat, okay? Rabbinic sources learn this in an unusual way. As we know, there's a blanket ban on milacha, on various kinds of creative labor on Shabbat.
You would think that you wouldn't need to say that you can't execute people because it would sort of fall under other prohibitions.
Yeah, you might
be obvious.
You might think that the way, but they don't assume that, because if the Torah tells you about someone mot yumat, they must surely be put to death. Maybe that person's like a threat to society, justice delayed is justice denied. Maybe, that really supersedes Shabbat the same way the temple does. They pick up on the fact that the Torah is pretty opaque about what counts as melacha, right? It doesn't spell out what those actions are, except in one place. It says, Lo tavaru esh b'chol moshvotechem. Don't manipulate fire in any way wherever you are. And the Torah elsewhere prescribes fire as one of the methods of execution for certain sins. And so there was a rabbinic tradition that said, why did the Torah go out of its way to single out fire? To tell you, you may not use fire on Shabbat, even though I've told you to use fire, esh, that word appears in those contexts also, in the context of execution, and that teaches you no execution on Shabbat. Now, of course, you use fire in the sacrifices also, but the word esh,
which is also a kind of execution
of animals, correct. So
this is totally separate activity.
It's probably one of these midrashim that both is reading the Torah carefully, but also there's a kind of pre-existing or parallel existing idea about not executing. But in any event, that's premise number two. That is to say, a reasonable reading of the Torah and ironclad consensus of the rabbis is, number one, the temple service supersedes Shabbat. Number two, you do not execute people on Shabbat. So what might I reasonably conclude from those two premises?
What?
That we don't interrupt the temple service to execute people, okay? Because let's play it out. If
A is more important than B, and B is more important than C.
Or is not more important, right? Exactly. It's a little bit of an LSAT question here.
With C.
Right? If you can't violate Shabbat to execute someone, okay, and the temple supersedes Shabbat, okay, then you might reasonably reach the conclusion that you're not going to interrupt the temple service in order to execute someone. All right. So let's say, for instance, let's just make it practical. What are they talking about?
Please.
Let's say there's a Kohen, there's a priest, okay? And he's sort of getting ready to perform a sacrifice. But essentially then it becomes clear that he has committed murder.
Oh, he's the doomed person.
Exactly. Well, then you might say, right, I gotta pull him out. And the answer would be,
wait till he's done.
You got to wait till he's done. That's what you might think. And this all builds up to the fact that the Torah actually tells you, when you find a killer, when you find someone who basically has been convicted, or you have evidence that they are a deliberate murderer, me'im mizbechi tikachenu lamut. You take that person away from the temple service in order to execute them. So the whole process, you might have thought this, the Torah actually weighs in very clearly, as the rabbis read it, and say, no. When you are bringing someone to justice, I don't care if they are sort of in line to do some really important sacred task. You pull them out of line and you go forward with the criminal justice proceeding.
Okay, and the reason why we have this instruction is because you otherwise would have thought not.
Exactly. That's why the Torah needs to go out of its way in this reading to tell you about that verse. The verse on its own seems to be about someone trying to get sanctuary by holding on to the altar.
Yeah.
But it's used by the rabbinic tradition basically to say the pursuit of that criminal justice case is basically more important than anything else, even though you might have thought temple's so important, supersedes Shabbat, so it must also supersede, the criminal justice proceeding. No, that's not right. Me'im mizbechi tikachenu lamut, you got to pull that person away. All right? That's piece one. Rabbi Akiva then comes along and says, yeah. Me'im mizbechi tikachenu lamut. You take that person off to their criminal justice proceeding when they're with the altar, but not me'al mizbechi, not if they're on the altar. Meaning, someone is sort of in line about to be, involved. Imagine it's like someone's scheduled to daven musaf, as it were, okay?
Yeah.
And during the Haftorah, you get an update that they're a convicted murderer, right? Or you've got evidence against them. You give them the hook. But if they're in the middle of the musaf amida, as it were, okay? Or in the case of the temple, they've actually ascended the ramp. They're up top. They are dealing with the sacrifice, rearranging the logs. You don't, says Rabbi Akiva, interrupt in the middle of the action. You wait till they finish, and then you haul them off in handcuffs. But there is a certain kind of integrity to the service itself that has to be seen through. Actually, super interesting for thinking about just in general, the power of rituals. I mean, this comes up sometimes in very uncomfortable ways. Someone will get sick in shul, or someone might, God forbid, sort of pass out, have a fainting spell or something in the middle of the service. And often, I don't know if you've been in those spaces, I have, there's this sort of discomfort of, on the one hand, there's an instinct of stop everything, like the whole thing should shut down.
You mean someone else, not the davener.
Not the davener, right, in general.
Right.
And there's another instinct of, well, but like we're in the middle here, right? Or the community needs to continue. So this is, I think, responding in a similar way. Rabbi Akiva wants to say, I buy that principle of the criminal justice thing is important, but not at the price of interrupting the actual service in the middle.
Do you want to give us your quick side guidance for when that happens? Do you actually, if you're the davener, do you stop?
Yeah, I actually think the right mode there, of course, every case is different, but the right mode there is that you actually need a division of labor in that moment. That is to say, you might have to stop. If the davener is the only person capable of giving some direction of what to do, they might have to pause or give a hand signal. But ideally in that case, let's say if I were the rabbinic presence in the room, I would essentially tell the davener to continue while the requisite number of people were caring to the person in crisis. And then at the appropriate moment, you say something and you add a Misha Berach or you do whatever it is. But I actually think, both of those things need to be held in that moment. Of course, if you needed everyone in the room to save the person's life, well, then of course you do that.
Right. All right. It's that feels so intuitive and helpful, and also like it just feels like that's sort of the opposite of like, but what if I need to kill you at the same moment that you're leading Musaf?
Right. Which is really hard, and that's the part where Rabbi Akiva is just like, forget it. Like you cannot interrupt the temple service. In a way, it's going back to the instinct of, I don't know if the temple service actually supersedes Shabbat. So how could it be that anything else is going to get in the way? Okay, next step. Rabbi Yochanan then pipes up and says, yeah. Rabbi Akiva, sure, but that's only lamut. That's only if you would be pulling someone off the altar in order to execute them. But we do not say that lehachayot, in order to keep someone alive. Meaning what? Rashi clarifies what's meant here. If the person, the Kohen in this case, on top of the altar, in the middle of the temple service, hears, oh, so-and-so was just convicted of murder. And you have to sort of imagine some like light chatter going on among the Kohanim during the service. And then he says, oh my God, that's not right. Like he was with me on that day. Like he can't possibly, I have evidence that would exonerate him. Says Rabbi Yochanan, he drops the logs and the animal parts and runs down the ramp to save this guy. Okay? Rabbi Yochanan wants to say, if we're talking about, getting you your justice, so we delay that in order not to disrupt the temple service. But if we're talking about saving someone from a wrongful conviction, there's nothing more important than that, including the temple service itself.
Yeah. So saving the life is just fundamentally much more important than enacting the execution.
Yeah.
And more urgent, maybe.
And what's sort of amazing here is that whole sequence, Rabbi Akiva, Rabbi Yochanan, the whole analysis, is used by the Talmud to prove that we violate Shabbat or other mitzvot even when there's just a chance that we will save someone's life. Because after all, when you have what you believe is exonerating evidence, the court may or may not accept it. It's not as if you're the doctor with the antidote to a poison who can simply go in and do it. This guy is just saying, I think I could testify and maybe get this guy off, but he doesn't actually know if he can get him off. And we nonetheless say, primarily in the mouth of Rabbi Yochanan, you think you have some evidence that might be exonerating? Interrupt the temple service, drop everything, and give it a shot.
Yeah, it certainly sounds very relevant as a text for this case. You can sort of imagine the questioner like, I have the brief. I'm the only one who has the brief, and I'm going to run out in the middle of shul, even if I'm davening Musaf.
Yes.
I'm going to step out to go file my brief.
That's right. I think and this is what I was saying at the beginning, I think this is kind of amazing of what sounds like the most, modern question you can get. It literally has a direct precedent because just follow it one more step. So if the conclusion of this discussion is that, you interrupt the temple service in order to file the appeal, as it were, and if the temple service outranks Shabbat, then you would certainly violate Shabbat to file the appeal.
Yeah.
Right? That's just actually a simple logical extension of all the premises that we've held. But there's one more twist.
Okay.
The one more twist is this. Rava, later sage in the Talmud, doesn't like this proof as a basis for the idea that, you can always violate Shabbat, even in sort of the doubtful pursuit of saving someone's life. He wants a robust proof for that. He says this isn't robust enough because Abaye, yet another sage, when he heard Rabbi Yochanan say this, or when he thought about a similar kind of case, said, no, you only pull people out of line or sort of turn the person being executed back from the gallows when the suggested exonerating evidence has been vetted by two scholars. Meaning, you can't just as, says the Talmud, you can't just as the Kohen in the middle of the temple service drop everything and go because you think you have exonerating evidence. You basically need two scholars / legal experts who are maybe hanging around the temple courtyard to say to them, hey guys, I think I have this exonerating evidence. Is this
worth it?
Yeah. Is that going to pass muster in terms of evidence? And if they say, no, we don't think so, then you have no right to leave. If they sign on to it, you have a right to leave.
It actually feels even more like our question, because it's okay, he's been working on the brief. And he actually, he's a lawyer. He actually knows what he's filing. This could be legitimate. If he didn't think it could, he probably wouldn't bother.
Yeah. So this is actually where I think it leads us maybe to the sort of practical conclusion here. So again, right, as you just said, it's an amazing match, right, for the whole case here. A reminder also that sometimes things that sound like obscure discussions of what went on in the temple and ancient courts of old, that who knows how much they were even operative at what period in time.
Like reading through these texts, you might be like, skip that page.
Yeah.
Irrelevant.
And we're here to say, as always, don't skip that page, right? There's an incredible amount that's relevant here. And indeed, it seems to come down to a claim that, well, if you can sort of verify by professional, legal, in this case, rabbinic, halachic standards vis-a-vis their execution system, that something is a viable shot at overturning something, that would violate Shabbat. And if it's not vetted at that level, right, it's just sort of your instinct that maybe it would help, that's not enough.
This is a good time to take a quick break. We'll get right back to this episode, but first I want to let you know about an upcoming program with Hadar that you will love. The Hadar National Shabbaton, January 30th to February 1st in East Brunswick, New Jersey. This is a Shabbat of powerful davening, engaging learning, delicious meals, and great kids programming. Come connect with an incredible network of people working together to build more meaningful Jewish lives. Visit hadar.org/Shabbaton for more information. Now let's dive back in.
So here's where I would sort of come down on this, and we can sort of talk through what it means practically. Here's what I think is clear, okay? What's clear is that if you're sitting there as a lawyer and you feel you have sort of plausible grounds through some either evidence or argument that would pass muster before a judge to overturn what you feel to be a wrongful conviction for whatever reason, substantive, procedural, etc., you definitely would, in principle, violate Shabbat to get that done. You essentially have someone who is going to be executed, you believe wrongly, you think you have the ability to hold that off, and therefore you got to do it. But this the lawyers can speak to more than I can, but I think there is a difference sometimes between dilatory and substantive objections, which is to say, sometimes certain appeals or certain lines of argument, a lawyer can look at it and say, this isn't going to help, but I owe my client sort of I don't even know if it's the shot, like every move possible to delay this.
I was going to ask you that question, actually, if delaying, the death is the same category of pikuach nefesh, of saving a life, or if it has to be like overturning the conviction.
So in general, we would say any additional amount of life that you grant someone is worth it. Like, for instance, if you say, I could violate Shabbat and this person would live another 8 hours, right? But that's it. We say that's a justified violation of Shabbat.
Any life is life.
Because any life is life. That's at least how the later discussion comes out. There's some, dithering along the way, but that's where it ends up. But I don't think that's the same when you're dealing with a conviction where if it's correct, then the person on some level is meant to die. You could be opposed to the death penalty, I understand. But from within the framework of, let's say, quote unquote, justice being done, and certainly from the framework of the rabbinic sources we're seeing, if the person really deserves to be executed by fair evidence, rabbinic sources believe in that process being seen through. In that sense, it's the overturning that then is critical to justify otherwise, right, rupturing something else super important, whether it's the temple service in progress or Shabbat itself, because the outcome, if not unjust, is just.
So this leads me also to wonder, halachically, would it matter that this death sentence didn't come from our process? This is not a halachic court. it's not a court of Jewish law, and we have no way, you and I, of assessing, and probably even this lawyer who wrote the question has no way of assessing whether this person should be earning the death penalty through Jewish law, and certainly the execution will not be according to Jewish law. So do we take into account any element of like, oh, that person was destined to die? Or is it like totally we are outside of the bounds of that discussion?
So look, here's the irony of the whole question. There's a reason that the Talmud only addresses this case in the context of the temple service and not Shabbat. Because as we said at the beginning, in Jewish procedure, you don't execute people on Shabbat.
Like it would never come up.
It would never come up. There would never be a brief you're filing on Friday afternoon because the court would be in recess till Sunday morning, right? And so while we can extend the principle, which is what I tried to articulate,
really
once it says it about the temple service, by logic, it would say it about Shabbat, but that could only come up with a non-Jewish court, right? And that is where, indeed, it becomes, I think, a little bit complicated, where on the one hand, I think you do have to say, at the end of the day, you have a human being, their life is on the line, you feel they're wrongly convicted, assuming there's someone you would violate Shabbat to save their life, you're justified/required to intervene. Who cares what the considerations are? But when you think about your role in that system, as an observant Jew, there's no question that the system in another dimension is at odds with your values, which is it's executing people on a day when your system wouldn't be executing people. Right. So there, I don't want to overstep my expertise here, right? But I think if we think about what the system is saying, I don't think the Jewish law sources here would overall smile on the possibility of dilatory challenges to the execution that you know are going to fail. They're not going to overturn anything, but it might create the need for a judge to respond and smack it down, and it draws things out. That feels hard internally to justify a violation of Shabbat for, as opposed to something, which I think is most of the cases, where someone is saying, no, I'm filing this brief because I feel there are substantive grounds to overturn the conclusion. That said, people have responsibility to their clients. And I think we'll get back to the questioner's specific parameters in a minute, but if the expectation of a client with representation in this case is that the lawyer is going to do even like dilatory actions to do anything to push off the execution, it may be totally professionally inappropriate to say, well, I'm going to just let that part slide, because though I might even feel fine about saying, well, that's the appropriate balancing of Shabbat in the process, that's actually not what I was hired for. I was hired to not just stop, but delay this at all costs.
And or like, if I would do it on a Thursday, shouldn't I do it on a Friday? Like, should my Shabbos really be the difference between this person's case getting this filed or not? I wonder if you have a thought, this is maybe small potatoes, but of like, I should do it, I should have my clerk do it.
So look, this is where the question, right, ultimately comes up, which is to say, the way the questioner framed it was, my usual practice is I line up non-Jewish colleagues, and they seem to feel that's fine in terms of their professional obligations.
Right. It's not like I am a unique lawyer and I could push it through where my colleague couldn't.
Correct. But did I need to do that? And that's where I think the way my answer would come out is, if you're asking me in principle, I would say, to the extent that, the delaying without any hope of overturning is part of the job, that does seem to me it is appropriate, when possible, to delegate to a non-Shabbat observant, right, non-Jewish colleague to take care of that, assuming that checks the professional boxes, which it seems here it clearly does because the person is doing that. Whereas if you're asking me, where are the cases where I wouldn't feel I needed to do that? Well, in cases where you feel like there's a real argument here for overturning, I think that is a case where, you don't need to hand it off in those contexts. Now, I can't speak to how confusing or non-confusing is that to colleagues? What message does that send? And is this just the better protocol to have in general? And even if the questioner ends up saying, okay, what I take from this episode is because there are some cases where it really might not be great if I'm doing that work on Shabbat, I just want to, in all cases, keep it this way. I would still be invested in, though, them appreciating, on some level, affirming their instinct that there are indeed contexts where I think a straight up reading of the normative sources here would say, yeah, there are legal interventions in pursuit of overturning a verdict that you indeed do on Shabbat to save a life.
Yeah. It's so striking, the case that you've brought and how relevant it feels to the question. I want to share a response to this that is maybe an emotional response as opposed to a legal response.
Yeah.
Usually when this happens, when someone submits a very modern question and we find, or you bring us like such a relevant case, I usually feel very excited about that. There is something very validating and moving to me to say like, oh, we're asking the same questions that our ancestors asked.
Yeah.
I don't have that experience with this question. I actually have a sinking feeling.
Interesting.
It feels a little bit like, wow, the death penalty, that's something we're still doing. You know, like when we look at whether this ancient case is relevant, to say like the temple sacrifice, the holiness piece that brings us closer to God, like that's irrelevant, right? But like actually enacting a death penalty, well, that's extremely relevant now. Like we've kept the wrong part of this story and brought it into modern times. That leaves me feeling a little bit hollow.
Yeah, I hear you. I mean, look, as you say, a lot of this is bound up with how you react to the principle, if not the practice, of the death penalty, which is, you know, super complicated. I assume we have some range among our listeners. You and I probably think about it a little differently. I think I resonate a little more with the principle of the justice of, you know, having sort of the ultimate consequence for, you know, doing certain ultimate things. Even as in practice, I, like the rabbinic sources, have a lot of questions about when that should play out. But it is true, like however you cut it, even if you're okay with the death penalty, it's still upsetting that there are people who need to be executed or that there are people who the system or society is still, you know, having to be accountable to that piece. And I guess that piece of what you're saying resonates with me, right? Like when you think about interrupting Shabbat, you would like it to be because, well, something tragic happened and you need to intervene to save someone's life. There's something sad about having to ask the question of, I have to intervene because there's some complex of wrongdoing and retribution and all of this that's playing out. And again, I don't blame the United States justice system for not observing Shabbat.
Yeah.
But there is also something sad always, I think, when Shomer Shabbat people are in a non-Shomer Shabbat environment of just confronting, God, there was this profound thing that even those on death row get Shabbat in the Jewish system, right? We don't execute on Shabbat. And that's a place where I feel a little bit of the loss, right? There's just no break for our day.
Do you happen to know, like, do we not execute on Sundays?
America,
I mean?
I assume it's state by state, but I don't know the answer for that.
Because I could totally see that being the case, meaning, you know, in Georgia, you can't buy alcohol on Sundays.
I assume it is the case in some states, be worth looking up. And even if so, right, even if that principle is live from a Christian Day of Rest perspective, you're still feeling the dissonance as a Jew vis-a-vis your Shabbat, your Sabbath.
I think you're helping me also realize, like, yeah, maybe there's multiple elements here of that sinking feeling that I'm having. And one might be like, I have an anti-death penalty instinct that is awakened by this question.
Yeah.
And the other is just like a plain and simple, like, well, maybe the fact that we still have the kind of crimes for which we are trying to enact the death penalty is sad. Like, we've lost that pursuit of holiness as a central element. It's been thousands of years. We haven't figured out how to, like, not have these crimes anymore. That feels I guess maybe that should give me some of that, like, yeah, we're hitting up on something real and primal about what it means to be human, but I still feel sad about it.
Yeah. No, I hear that.
It leaves me feeling a lot of gratitude, though, for the person who wrote this question, and the kind of work that they do, and the people who really put these questions central to their lives and their day-to-day work. The sinking feeling I have in my heart now, I imagine, is like a daily companion for the person who wrote this question. And so for that, I want to offer gratitude.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Tedious this business, trading violent swings, round bell rings. It's a stay of execution, love. It's a brief reprieve.
Have a halachic question you'd like answered on the show? Email us at responsa@hadar.org. Responsa Radio is a project of the Hadar Institute. Thanks to Chana Kupetz and Jeremy Tabak for producing this podcast, and to David Chabinski for recording and editing this episode.
How am I supposed to beg for mercy when I can barely breathe? And it's a hard burden to shoulder. It's been a heavy weight.